Today is 13th of April, 13th of April 2020. The COVID-19 lockdown continues in India. It looks like there will be an extension by at least another couple of weeks. So we are all sitting at home, and I thought I will read and discuss a few things with you. Last time I talked about a Bengali poem and a Bengali short story in the language in Bangla. Today is a specific and a very special day for someone like me because it happens to be the birthday of two people I have been reading and working on for almost 10 to 15 years now. One of them is the Irish playwright and novelist and writer Samuel Beckett. He was born on this particular day in the year 1906. And the other one is the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, who was born again on the same date in the year 1901. So it happens to be the birthday of these two people I admire, like, engage with, read, and write on. And I will try and do a reading and a discussion around two, let's say, sections, small sections of their work. And I'll try and be as lucid as possible, not try and do an academic discussion with its own academic meta language, shall we say. So, I mean, I started reading Samuel Beckett back in 2005, 2004, 2005, when I was in my undergrad first year in Presidency College, Calcutta. I remember taking out the old Beckett fictions from the library. I think it was Murphy and the Unnameable in that order that I borrowed from the Presidency College library. And I realized that the books had not been borrowed, those two books had not been borrowed after the 70s, perhaps, and this was 2005. Something was unlocked, something triggered that day, and it has stayed with me for all these years. It's been, as I said, more than 15 years of reading, engaging, and in a way, cohabiting, as it were, with someone like Beckett. Now, Samuel Beckett is, of course, well known for his theatre works, and Waiting for Godot, Onotondo Godo being the most famous one. I'll deliberately not read a long text for obvious reasons. I will read a text which is perhaps not that widely read beyond Beckett studies, Beckett scholarship. It's a text called Texts for Nothing, which is basically a collection of 13 small texts, by and large on the idea of nothingness or the void. I'm going to read one of these texts from Texts for Nothing, and I'm reading from this beautiful Grove Press Centennial edition, which I remember getting hold of in my final year, I think, of my undergraduate course. And it's a precious book because it has all these subjective histories of my own engagement with Beckett writ large on it. So I will read the ninth text from Texts for Nothing, and we'll very briefly touch upon certain aspects of this text as much as we can here. Let me read it. This is Texts for Nothing, Samuel Beckett, text number 9. If I said there's a way out there, there's a way out somewhere, the rest would come. What am I waiting for then? To say it? To believe it? And what does that mean, the rest? Shall I answer? Try and answer? Or go on as though I had asked nothing? I don't know. I can't know beforehand. nor after, nor during. The future will tell. Some future instant, soon or late. I won't hear. I won't understand. All dies so fast, no sooner born. And the yeses and nos mean nothing in this mouth, no more than sighs. It sighs in its toil, or answers to a question not understood, a question unspoken. In the eyes of a mute, an idiot who doesn't understand, never understood, who stares at himself in a glass before him in the desert, sighing yes, sighing no, on and off. But there is reasoning somewhere, moments of reasoning. That is to say, the same things recur. They drive one another out. They draw one another back. No need to know what things. It's mechanical, like the great colds, the great heats, the long days, the long nights of the moon. Such is my conviction. For I have convictions. When their turn comes round, then stop having them. That's how it goes. It must be supposed, at least it must be said, since I've just said it. The way out this evening, it's the turn of the way out. Isn't it like a duo or a trio? Yes, there are moments when it's like that. Then they pass, and it's not like that anymore. Never was like that. Is like nothing. No resemblance with anything, of no interest. What variety! And at the same time, what monotony! How varied it is, and at the same time, how, what's the word? How monotonous! What agitation, and at the same time, what calm! What vicissitudes within, what changelessness! Moments of hesitation, not so much rare as frequent, if one had to choose, and soon overcome in favor of the old crux on which at first all depends, then much, then little, then nothing. That's right, word shit. Bury me, avalanche, and let there be no more talk of any creature, nor of a world to leave, nor of a world to reach, in order to have done with worlds, with creatures, with words, with misery, misery, which no sooner said, says I, punctually, if only I could say, there's a way out there, there's a way out somewhere, then all would be said, would be the first step. It would be the first step on the long, travelable road, destination tum, to be trod without a word. Tramp, tramp, little heavy, irrevocable steps down the long tunnels at first, then under the mortal skies, through the days and nights, faster and faster, no, slower and slower, for obvious reasons, and at the same time faster and faster for other obvious reasons, or the same, obvious in a different way, or in the same way, but at a different moment of time, a moment earlier, a moment later, or at the same moment. There is no such thing. There would be no such thing. I recapitulate, impossible. Would I know where I came from? No. I'd have a mother. I'd have had a mother. And what I came out of? With what pain? No. I would have forgotten. What is it makes me say that? What is it makes me say this? Whatever it is makes me say all. And it's not certain, not certain the way the mother would be certain, the way the tum would be certain. If there was a way out, if I said there was a way out, make me say it, demons. No, I'll ask for nothing. Yes, I'd have a mother. I'd have a tomb, my tomb and mother. It's all here this evening. I'm dead and getting born without having ended, helpless to begin. That's my life. How reasonable it is. And what am I complaining of? Is it because I'm no longer slinking to and fro before the graveyard, saying, God grant I'm buriable before the curtain drops? Is that my grievance? It's possible. I was well inspired to be anxious, wondering on what score, and I asked myself as I came and went, on what score I could possibly be anxious. and found the answer and answered, saying, "It's not me. I haven't yet appeared. I haven't yet been noticed." And saying further, "Oh, yes, it is. It's me, all right." And ceasing to be what is more, then quickening my step so as to arrive before the next onslaught, as though it were on time I trod, and saying further, and so forth, I can scarcely have gone unperceived all this time, and yet you wouldn't have thought so, that I didn't go unperceived. I don't refer to the spoken salutation. I'd have been the first to be perturbed by that almost as much as by the bow, kiss, or handshake. But the other signs, irrepressible, with which the fellow creature unwillingly betrays your presence, the shudders and wry faces, nothing of that nature either, it would seem, except possibly on the part of certain hearse horses, in spite of their blinkers and strict funereal training. But perhaps I flatter myself. Truly, I can't recall a single face. Proof positive that I was not there. No, proof of nothing. But the fact that I was not molested, can I have remained insensible to that? Alas, I fear they could have subjected me to the most gratifying brutalities. I won't go so far as to say without my knowledge, but without my being encouraged, as a result, to feel myself there rather than elsewhere. And I may well have spent one half of my life in the prisons of their Arcady, purging the delinquencies of the other half, all unaware of any break or lull in my problematic patrolling, unconstrained before the gates of the graveyard. But what if, weary of seeing me relieve myself, of seeing me resume, after each forced vacation, my beat before the gates of the graveyard, what if finally they had plucked up heart and slightly stressed their blows, just enough to confer death, without any mutilation of the corpse, there, at the gates of the graveyard, where that very morning I had reappeared, no sooner set at large, and resumed by old offence, to and fro, with step now slow and now precipitate, like that of the conspirator Catalina, plotting the ruin of the fatherland, saying, "It's not me. Yes, it's me." And further, "There's a way out there." No, I'm getting mixed. I must be getting mixed. Confusing here and there, now and then, just as I confuse them, then, the here of then, the then of here, with other spaces, other times, dimly discerned, but not more dimly than now. Now that I am here, if I am here, and no longer there, coming and going before the graveyard, perplexed. Or did I end up by simply sitting down, with my back to the wall, all the long night before me, when the dead lie waiting on the beds where they died, shrouded or coffined, for the sun to rise? What am I doing now? I'm trying to see where I am, so as to be able to go elsewhere, should occasion arise, or else simply to say, "You've merely to wait till they come and fetch you." That's my impression at times. Then it goes. And I see it's not that, but something else, difficult to grasp, and which I don't grasp, or which I do grasp. It depends, and it comes to the same. For it's not that either, but something else, some other thing, or the first back again, or still the same, always the same thing, proposing itself to my perplexity, then disappearing, then proposing itself again to my perplexity, still unsated, or momentarily dead of starvation. The graveyard, yes, it's there, I would return. This evening it's there, borne by my words. If I could get out of here, that is to say, if I could say there's a way out there, there's a way out somewhere, to know exactly where would be a mere matter of time and patience and sequency of thought and felicity of expression. But the body? To get there with, where's the body? It's a minor point, a minor point. And I have no doubts. I'd get there somehow, to the way out, sooner or later. If I could say, there's a way out there, there's a way out somewhere, the rest would come. the other words sooner or later, and the power to get there, and the way to get there and pass out, and see the beauties of the skies, and see the stars again. That's where the text ends. So, historically, Text for Nothing was written after the end of Beckett's trilogy, Malloy, Malone Dies, and The Unnameable, in the 50s. And he said that he was in some sort of a writer's block, some sort of an impasse of writing was haunting him. And according to him, this particular series of texts was an attempt to go out of that deadlock of writing. But again, if we are to believe him, it failed. In Beckett, this is always a question. The failure of narration, the failure of storytelling becomes generative in itself. The failure of a narrative formation becomes the generative point for another narrative formation. Such is the irony or paradox, whatever you want to call it, of this failure. I mean, as we saw in this text, it's a text about a desperate person who wants to get out of the confinement. It's difficult to, use a gender here. These are not gender-specific subjects quite often in Beckett. Let's say this personage is trying to get out of this hellhole and being unable to do so, thinking of all kinds of sufferings, tortures inflicted on him or her by these anonymous people, as it were. We are not very sure who they are. We are not very sure to what extent Beckett is talking about an existential or a historical or a trans-historical kind of torture. After the wars, we are talking about 60s France when he's writing this text. But as always, he does not give us a very specific historical context. There is one historical reference to Catilina, and that's an interesting reference because Catalina was, Catiline or Catalina was the famous conspirator who went against Cicero, went against the Roman Empire, as it were. So that particular reference is the only historical reference couched in a rhetoric of patriotism, nationalism, and a so-called conspiracy against that love of the country, the fatherland, as Beckett calls it. But there's a fundamental gesture of contradiction in this text. The contradiction is whether I am I, whether it's someone else who speaks through me. And this contradiction recurs all through this series of texts and much of Beckett's other writings as well. So there's not just a fragmentation of the self. There is, of course, a fragmentation, a multiplication of the self. But at the same time, there's also an alienation from each of these fragmented selves when language comes out of the human mouth, as it were. So the confusion or the contradiction is, when I speak, I know it's not I who speaks, and yet there is no one else with me. So I have to somehow arrive at this conclusion that it's me speaking. This particular rigmarole of the I and the not I is quite central to Beckett's idea of speech as a linguistic function in the human subject. The contradictions that we noted throughout the text, whether it's here, whether it's there, whether it's me, whether it's not me, they are, as I said, fundamental to this failed attempt at storytelling, as it were. But I want to use the opening and perhaps the most central gesture in this text to make a segue to Lacanian psychoanalysis and talk about Lacan now for the rest of this video. And this is the segue. So if you remember, this text begins with this gesture. Let me read out again. If I said, there's a way out there, there's a way out somewhere, the rest would come. There's a strange belief in speech to curve a way out, of the hellhole here that the subject finds himself or herself in. So, this strange belief in words, in talking, in saying, in dire in French, the saying, uh, this belief in the saying that if I say there's a way out, I will be able to reach it. In the middle of this despair that the text suffuses with, we do have this very strong conviction that if we are able to verbalize something, if we are able to say it, perhaps there will be a way out. Now, this will be my segue into psychoanalysis, which is a method of talking cure, as famously defined by its inaugurator, Sigmund Freud. So, it's not a medicinal practice, it's not a medical practice, it is a practice of mental health where there is this fundamental conviction that verbalization can address our symptoms. The talking itself could be a method of cure. So I will extract this psychoanalytic belief in the curative function of words, the talking function, as it were, and make a segue to Jacques Lacan. Now, Lacan, in his early teachings, was attempting to read Freud with Saussure and create a linguistic pathway for psychoanalysis. The famous formulation from this classical period of his teaching is the unconscious is structured like a language. In Psychoanalysis Cartel, we are currently reading the recently translated English edition of Seminar 6, Desire and its Interpretation, Seminar 6. It's a seminar on desire, desire's relation with language, and Lacan is in a way formulating a certain notion of desire from Freud's idea of the unconscious wish or the Wunsch. Now, in this seminar, at length, he does a reading of Shakespeare's Hamlet, not to mention a series of very interesting remarks on the French playwright Jean Genet's The Balcony, and generally a set of remarks on Genet. In the cartel on the seminar, we are currently reading the third session of the seminar, and I thought I will zoom in on one particular aspect of this third session. Of course, Lacan's seminars are diffused to a certain extent. There's no sustained reading. He moves from one topic to another, partially because it's speech. It's not written for publication. It's a series of spoken seminars that are published subsequently after transcription. So I'm going to talk about only one particular micro aspect of this third session, but you will see how it connects back to the Beckett text to a certain extent, at least. Here, Lacan is talking about associationism in pre-psychoanalytic psychology, experimental psychology, positive psychology, and the notion of associationism there. And he's trying to see to what extent the trace of associationism remains in the technique of the so-called free association in psychoanalysis. So in this context, he's talking about desire, language, the way the two figures of metaphor and metonymy work in language, and how desire operates in relation to these figures in language. So metaphor, as we know, is built on the idea of similarity. Two things are similar, and we either draw a similitude between the two things by explicitly mentioning the point of similarity, or we draw a metaphorical connection between the two things by making the connection or the similarity implicit. So when the similarity is made implicit, it's a metaphor. Lacan associates metaphors with symptoms and metonymy with desire. Metonymy as a figure, as a rhetorical figure, is about contiguity, or it's about substitution. The linguist Roman Jakobson, whose ideas Lacan is borrowing here, has these two levels of language that he talks about. So Jakobson talks about selection as one level of language and combination as another level of language. So very simply, we select words, the words that we want to use. For example, I'm selecting certain words and not selecting others as I speak to you here in this live video. And so that's the selection, the axis of selection, which is essentially a vertical axis. So I'm selecting the words that I want to select and not selecting other words which are remaining somewhere, as it were, on the baseline. So I'm making a vertical movement by selecting certain words. Now, after that, I will make a horizontal movement, which would be the axis of combination for Jakobson. What is this axis of combination? It's not enough to select words. We have to contiguously, successively create a certain sequence of words and string them together into a sentence, into sentences. So that's the second order, or the second axis, the horizontal axis, or the axis of combination. So contiguity goes with combination. Metonymy, substitution. Metonymy is all about substituting one word with another. When we make a movement in our sentences, we contiguously move from one word to another. And that's a metonymic substitutive flow in language. As opposed to that, we have a certain concentration in a metaphor. So a metaphor is like a point of concentration in language, and symptoms are metaphorical. That's the Lacanian point, whereas desire is metonymic. Desire moves across language, moves along the horizontal axis of language, like the metonymic rhetorical movement of substitution. So he's aligning metaphor and symptom together, as it were, and he's aligning, metonymy and desire on the horizontal axis of language. Now, with this contextualization, I want to read a brief part of the third session of Seminar 6, where he's talking about narrative. So that's my connection here between psychoanalysis and literature. He's talking about narrative here. And as I said, he's talking about free association. So unlike a popular misconception about psychoanalysis, psychoanalysis is not confessions. And as psychoanalysts, we never ask the analysans to speak about anything. The analysand may choose to speak on anything and everything they want. They may not choose to speak. In that case, we are not there to extract speech from them. So it works by way of free association and not command or instruction. There is no confessional modality here. So when the analysand associates one word with another, let's say the analysand presents a dream, and we ask the analysand to free associate around the dream. Let's say if the analysand has seen a cherry in the dream, we might ask them to give us their own associations around the cherry. So what does the cherry remind them of? What is the cherry similar to? What is it like? Why do they think they could have seen a cherry in the dream, in the particular narrative context? And a dream is like a narrative. It's like a rebus. That's the famous Freud metaphor Lacan seizes on when he talks about this linguistic function of the unconscious. The dream is like a narrative. It's written. The dream is a piece of writing, as it were. It has a certain sentence structure which is constructed when the analysand recuperates the dream or recovers the dream in the clinical sessions. Now, here he's talking about free association. He's talking about the metonymic function, the substituting function of language. And he says, and he's talking about both metaphor and metonymy. I'm reading from page 47 of this text. If I speak of lips as being like cherries, I make a metaphorical use of the word cherry. Someone says the word lip, and it brings to my mind the word cherry. Why are they linked? Because they're both red, because they both have the same shape analogically, because they are similar owing to some attribute? No, not just that. Regardless of what is involved, we are immediately, and this is palpable, faced with an altogether substantial effect that is known as a metaphorical effect. When I speak of cherries with regard to lips in a word association experiment, there is no ambiguity whatsoever. We are at the level of metaphor in the most substantial sense of the term. And at the most formal level, a metaphorical effect always comes down to an effect of substitution of one term for another in the signifying chain. So the signifying chain is like a sentence. A sentence is a signifying chain. Now, what is interesting here is, of course, in a Jacobsonian way, he's talking about the connection between metaphor and metonymy. So there's a metaphorical similarity between the lips and the cherries. They're both red. That's why we metaphorize them and create a certain connection on the basis of their similarity. But at the same time, if I say cherry, you might be reminded of lips without me saying lips. Or if I say lips, you may be reminded of cherries without me saying cherries. So that's how association works. We associate one signifier, one word, with another in our mind. When I say a word, it might evoke another word for you. And without you telling me, I won't be able to connect the two words or understand the connection. In this case, it's fairly simple, cherry and lips, but it may not be that simple. Sometimes we associate a particular word with someone who uses that word very frequently. And that could be a very precise subjective association that I will not be able to understand unless you specifically say it to me. Okay. But let's come back to the Lacanian text. So, of course, there is metaphorical similarity here, but there's also a metonymic substitution. There is an order of contiguity. Let's see how he talks about that. If cherries come to mind here, it is inasmuch as they can be inscribed in a context, whether structural or not, in which lips figure, to which you could object that cherries might come to mind in relation to lips owing to the function of contiguity. It being possible that cherries disappear between the lips, or that a woman presented me with cherries while holding them with her lips. This is, of course, possible. It can happen. But what sort of contiguity is involved, if not the contiguity of the narrative I mentioned earlier? From the vantage point of the real, we must not allow ourselves to be deluded by the event in which this contiguity was integrated, which was such that a cherry was in fact momentarily in contact with the lips. What is important here is not that a cherry touch the lips, but that it be swallowed. It is not that it be held with the lips, it is that it be offered to us via an erotic gesture. If we stop the cherry for an instant while it is in contact with the lips, it is as a function of a snapshot or a flash that is provided by the narrative. What momentarily suspends the cherry between the lips is a sentence and words. It's an interesting argument he's trying to make here. He's talking about memory as a narrative, association as a narrative, and when we remember something, we create a certain narrative contiguity or a sequency of thought, to use the Beckett expression from the story, from the text that we just read before coming to Lacan. So there's a sequency of thought. There is a certain combinative level of language where words are strung together to form a sentence. Now, in that contiguous narrative, there could be a metonymic relation between the lip and the cherry. A woman might be having cherries, she might be putting the cherry inside her mouth. This might be an erotic gesture, and in this case, you might want to suspend in your memory this narrative at a precise point when she's about to swallow the cherry. So it's a narrative moment of suspension, or a snapshot, or a flash, as Lacan says. Now, this is our own manipulation of a memory. A memory is a narrative, yes, but at the same time, we also manipulate it and shift it and change it in a narrative, act, let's say. So here, the connection between cherry and lips is not necessarily metaphorical anymore. It is not a question of similarity. It is metonymic because it's a question of contiguity. It's a question of physical contact, but it's also a question of the sentence where you are freezing the narrative moment when this woman is about to swallow the cherry, and it becomes an erotic memory for the person concerned. Now, as we can see, there's a certain literary formation here in Lacan's example, and it becomes specifically literary because he's using terms like narrative, terms like snapshot, terms like a flash. So one could almost see a certain structure of a flash fiction, what we call a flash fiction, which is about a very striking particular moment, a very brief flash of a narrative in the form of a flash fiction. I'll end with the next paragraph because again it draws our attention to another aspect of this flash or the snapshot. Inversely, it is because the dimension of narrative that can freeze the frame or flash exists that the image created by the suspension of the narrative in effect becomes, in this case, something that stimulates desire. So we are now finally at the cusp of language and desire. How does language stimulate desire? How does speech stimulate desire? It is the involvement of language in the act that sets the tone here. It is after the fact that language introduces into the act a stimulation or stimulating element that is related to the stopping of the narrative. This suspension, which at times comes to fuel the act itself, takes on the value of fantasy, which gives a specific meander or a detour of the act an erotic signification. So, anyone having a cherry is not necessarily an erotic act. But if you suspend the narrative at that precise moment, when, in this case, a woman is just about to swallow the cherry, that narrative suspension eroticizes the act of remembrance, the act of narration in this case. Now, the interesting point here is, and that's the important Lacanian thread, the relation between desire and language. How does language stimulate desire? As I said, how does it stimulate desire? To a certain extent, it stimulates desire through this suspending function. This suspending function, which can translate a metaphorical association into a metonymic association. So there's a certain way in which the symptomatic metaphorizations of language are meeting here the metonymic associations of desire, the way desire gets displaced from one object to to another in the signifying chain of language. So, again, to put it simply, when I say cherry, you might think I'm talking about lips, even though I never use the word lips. Why are you associating lips with cherry? One possible interpretation is because both are red, they're similar, there's a metaphorical similarity, and that's why you're associating cherries with lips. But another association could be a metonymic or contiguous association, where you might be reminded of this woman who's swallowing a cherry. And that's your act of remembrance. During that act of remembrance, if you suspend the question of time, if you freeze, and there's a cinematic metaphor here, it's like the freeze shot, the freeze shot, which was used for the first time in 400 Blows, the famous film by Truffaut. In any case, coming back to the freeze frame, so when I say cherry, you might be reminded of this woman having a cherry, swallowing it in her lips. That's a memory in a narrativized context. Now, that memory could be suspended at that moment when she's just about to swallow it. Now, that suspension gives or would give an erotic quality to that memory. So it's the freeze frame which leads to a certain eroticization of the memory. And this is a narrative act of manipulation, suspension, but this also shows that the connection between cherry and lips may not just be metaphorical, it could also be metonymic. And in this case, this memory stimulates a certain kind of desire through the act of narrative suspension, which is also an act of eroticization of the memory. And finally, as Lacan indicates, and he would go deep into this question, there is a certain function of fantasy here. So language, desire, fantasy. These are the three things at work. And it's through the symptomatic axis of metaphors and the desire axis, shall we say, of metonymies, that in language, desire and fantasy can work together. I mean, of course, to make the final connection and close this discussion off, the connection between desire and language, the connection between desire and fantasy, and the connection between language, narrative, and fantasy, these are literary questions at a certain level. And we see them happening in Lacan's seminar, taking place in Lacan's seminar, like a literary event within the clinical communication or transmission or pedagogic transmission of psychoanalysis. And again, to remind ourselves of the segue, I moved from Beckett to Lacan on their shared psychoanalytic belief. And of course, Beckett was in psychotherapy. It's difficult to say whether it was psychoanalysis proper, because Bion, who was his analyst, was a training analyst at that. I mean, he was being trained as an analyst at that point. So there's quite a bit of debate whether Beckett's analysis could be called analysis proper, or is it more like a psychotherapy. In any case, he had psychotherapeutic experience. He was exposed to the psychotherapeutic clinic of some sort of a talking cure, let's say. Now, the talking cure, this conviction in the curative addressing function of language or words, is what leads us from Beckett's text, the 9th text of Text for Nothing that we read, to the seminar, or the little portion of the 3rd session of seminar 6 that we just read. This is, as I said, 13th April, Beckett and Lacan's birthday. They share their birthdays. I wrote a doctoral dissertation on them, which then became a book. I've been, as I said, working on them, and in a way, perhaps in my head, living with them for more than 15 years. So it's a very special day for me. And I thought, taking advantage of the lockdown, I will perhaps come and talk to you about some of these things. Of course, these are not things that I sort of did in terms of my doctoral research. There, my interest was to talk about Beckett and Lacan and the interface of psychoanalysis and literature through philosophy of mathematics, because in both Beckett's texts and in Lacanian discourse, we have a certain efficacy of mathematization. Mathematical and logical forms have a certain role to play in both their works in different ways. I mean, that was the focus on the focus of my doctoral dissertation. But since we are reading seminar 6 in psychoanalysis cartel at this point, and I came across this passage, and I thought this is again one of the many different ways in which we could frame the literary within psychoanalysis in a way and connect across both discourses, connect the literary with the psychoanalytic and vice versa. Yeah, so I think that's where I would end. The Beckett text, in a way, speaks to the lockdown situation and our trying to find a way out, as it were, in this quarantined universe. The Lacan text talks about language and desire. It's a question, right? I mean, under the present scenario, how do we keep desiring? And I would say we can keep desiring by talking, by conversing, by creating, by whichever means, collective signifying chains. And my attempt here was precisely along those lines. Thank you very much for your listening.